Hi, Yasmin. I'm very, very excited that joining us today, Steve Forbes, Chairman, Editor-in-Chief of Forbes Media. Steve, thank you for joining us.
Good to be here.
Let's talk about the U.S. first. Do you think the U.S. Will manage a soft landing? After all, the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, has managed to bring down inflation to about 3% without actually causing too much damage?
Well, it depends on how you define damage. The U.S. economy is not growing the way it should. A lot of people feel they've fallen behind in the last 2.5 years. Prices have gone up 20%. So even though the rate of inflation has come down, prices are still, for people, going up. Gasoline prices starting to rise again. So the Federal Reserve, I don't think, is going to be cutting interest rates anytime soon. At least they're not going to do any more damage to the economy. So we can take comfort from that. But the U.S. faces serious headwinds, and so I compare it to walking pneumonia. Not enough to put you in bed, but you don't feel that good.
Okay. So you're not particularly optimistic about the U.S. growth momentum and corporate earnings as such?
Not as much as some others are. I think there's some serious headwinds coming. A lot of consumers are overextended. As you know, credit card payments, car payments, those delinquencies are rising up. The U.S. Government revenues are going down, even though ostensibly the economy is growing. So the deficit has doubled, and that's going to start putting pressure on interest rates in the marketplace. So we're not going to be in a severe downturn, but we're not going to have a buoyant upturn, which is politically bad news for the Democrats.
Okay. We'll talk about politics in a little bit, but the U.S. dollar, it's been making a comeback of late. It's come off, well, the dollar index has gone up about 5% from its lows in mid-July. What's your outlook going forward for the dollar?
The dollar, I think, will do okay compared to the rest of the world. Japan has been employing all sorts of tools to try to keep that game going. I think eventually it's going to go above 150 yen to the dollar, especially as they try to keep suppressing interest rates. They've, as you know, the 10-year has gone up a little bit, but nowhere near what the U.S. is. So that's going to be very hard to maintain. The Brits are in trouble. The euro is not doing too badly as it did a year ago against the dollar. But all the currencies, I think, are in a state of flux. They're all weakening. It's just a matter of who weakens more.
Okay. Talking about funding, you said earlier that there's a lot of government debt out there. Funding for the federal government is about to run out at the end of this month, again, unless Congress takes action. Failure to pass spending, of course, could mean potential government shutdown again. Or potential, I say.
Usually these things, they don't go over a cliff, or they only do it for a day or two. There's no threat of a U.S. default, as you had a few months ago. But you have firebrands on both sides that say we must not compromise. I think at the end of the day, Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader, will cut a deal to extend the spending for a few weeks so they can get the appropriations bills through the various congressional committees and avoid these year-end in December where you get these monstrous bills all together and they throw everything in there. I think he wants to do it in a more orderly manner. But he'll have to have Democratic support to pull that off, which will be a bit of a setback.
Okay. And we have to talk politics, of course. The U.S. gearing up for the 2024 elections. What do you make of Biden versus Trump round two?
Not going to happen. Round two is not going to happen. Joe Biden, I don't think will be the Democratic nominee. One is he's visibly declining in terms of his capabilities of doing the job. The crimes, accusations against his son are starting to touch more and more on the father, and the U.S. economy won't be doing well politically. So statistically, they may say, oh, we're making some progress, but the average person is not going to feel it. And it's going to be an election on the economy, unless, of course, you get a big foreign crisis. But it's going to be what we call a bread and butter, a kitchen election. And so I think in the spring of next year, Joe Biden will say, I've gotten some great things done, but I'm going to step down for a new generation.
Who do you think is likely to step up from the Democratic side?
The Democratic side, the governor of California, is so eager that his staff say they have to get napkins because he drools so much at the prospect of running. So he would be the front runner. but they may pick an obscure figure, like years ago in 1976, they picked Jimmy Carter, then a totally unknown former governor of Georgia, as their nominee. None of the prospective candidates made it. So you could see somebody that no one has ever heard of become the Democratic nominee.
Okay. You mentioned the elections is about bread and butter issues. What about trade tensions between China and the U.S.? I mean, despite the recent high-stakes meetings that we had with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as well as U.S. Treasury Secretary, I should say, Janet Yellen, visiting Beijing back in June, July, are you optimistic about them repairing ties?
I think U.S.-Chinese relations are going to continue to be strained when we have an election coming up. And I don't see Xi Jinping pulling back on his desire to exert more Chinese influence in the South China Sea and things like that, and around the world. So those tensions are going to be there. What I think certainly the U.S. side has to watch out for is that we don't let trade tensions with China spill over into other areas. Trade is in trouble today. Trade is essential for a growing global economy. And right now, barriers are going up instead of down, talking about tariffs and things like that. Tariff is a tax. So I hope that after the elections next year, the U.S. will be negotiating an agreement with specific nations, get that back on track. Cannot let trade shrivel, because that hurts everybody.
Okay. There's concerns also about the economic slowdown in China. I think Beijing can deal with the short-term economic impacts and stuff, but it does have some longer-term challenges. I mean, demographics for one, and of course the high debt that the government has to cope with.
Well, they're finding out that the visible hand, Adam Smith talked in a free market, they're doing the visible hand. And you saw it when they went after Jack Ma, the greatest entrepreneur. The state-owned enterprises have now become more powerful. Party officials are now more involved in every business in China, which means you get less creativity. One of the things that was a hallmark before Xi Jinping took over was you had a lot of entrepreneurial activity that wasn't under the control of the government, and China was making some real breakthroughs in high tech and other areas. It wasn't just catching up to other countries; they were forging ahead in certain areas. That's gone now. The entrepreneurs there are very worried. They're all pulling back. They don't know what the environment's going to be. Many have come to Singapore and other areas. So that was a self-inflicted wound. And whether this current regime can repair that and inspire confidence again, very much of an open question. There are very real doubts about it. Very real unnecessary damage was done by this regime.
Could the property crisis in China be the last straw? I mean, we had Country Garden, its biggest developer, default on $2 bond coupon payments earlier this year.
Well, how much you can prop that up remains to be seen. And on one hand, the government knows you can't keep piling money into what Japan used to call zombie companies. But on the other hand, they don't seem willing to make the openings where entrepreneurship can flourish, the development of real capital markets can flourish. China says, oh, they want the yuan or a new BRIC currency, but you have to have open markets, capital markets, deep capital markets, and they're not doing the steps you need to develop those kinds of markets.
Okay, so still in trouble. Steve, it was very good to talk to you.
Good to be with you.
Steve Forbes, Chairman, Editor-in-Chief, Forbes Media.